Do you really choose your behavior? It's a pretty heavy question to kick things off, isn't it? I mean, really think about it for a second. When you react to a wildly stressful situation, or even when you just decide how to spend your lazy Sunday, are you making an entirely free choice? Or are you just following a deeply ingrained script written by the underlying building blocks of who you are? Well, today we are going to challenge your autonomy and dive deep into what actually makes you, well, you.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're demystifying personality and looking straight at the building blocks of you. We are going to take the abstract and, honestly, sometimes confusing world of personality psychology and break it all down. As you'll see, we're going to look at how scientists use these exact building blocks to practically predict real-world human behavior.
Here is our cognitive roadmap for this explainer, so you know exactly where we're headed. First, we'll ask what personality is, really. Then, we'll map out the mechanics of your mind and explore the 3 levels of you. From there, we'll tackle the big questions, look at how we're predicting behavior with AI, and finally, we'll land on the big 5 traits.
All right, diving right into Section 1, what is personality really?
If we consult top personality psychologist Feist and Feist, they define personality as a pattern of relatively permanent traits and unique characteristics. But the absolutely crucial point here is the second half of that definition. Personality gives both consistency and individuality to your behavior. Think of it as this invisible force that makes you reliably you across completely different days, while simultaneously setting you entirely apart from the person sitting right next to you.
And to really grasp personality, you have to understand the absolute center of this entire field: traits. Traits are those unique characteristics, like being a deeply respectful person or a highly genuine person, that influence how we act. But notice the operative word there: influence. Traits influence our behavior, they do not dictate it. So you might generally be a highly respectful person, but let's be real, if you're having a terrible sick day or you're running on 0 sleep, you might snap at someone and act completely out of character. This is exactly why traits are measured on a sliding scale, not as absolute, unbreakable guarantees. Let's move on to Section 2, the mechanics of your mind.
So how do traits actually process the world around us? Think of psychological mechanisms as the actual gears of your personality, working in a pretty straightforward 3-step system. Step 1 is the input. Let's imagine a dangerous situation. Step 2 is the decision rules. These rules are governed by your specific traits. If you happen to have the trait of courage, your internal rules are going to evaluate that dangerous input entirely differently than someone who lacks that trait. Finally, step 3 is the output. If you're a courageous person, the output is facing the danger head-on. If you aren't, the output is probably fleeing the scene. Your traits are basically acting as this massive internal filter, determining the output of literally every situation you encounter.
Zooming out a bit, here is Section 3, 3 levels of you.
To understand how psychologists measure and categorize us across the human race, we have to look at this famous 1953 quote from Kluckhohn and Murray. They stated, "Every man is in certain respects like all other men, like some other men, and like no other man." Now, I know it sounds a bit like a riddle at first, but it is actually a brilliant framework for understanding human similarity and difference.
Let's break that riddle down into the 3 levels of analysis. First up, the universal level. This is how you are like all other humans. We all have this fundamental, hardwired need to belong, we all search for a feeling of purpose, and we all have biological reflex reactions, like, tearing up if someone accidentally smacks you in the nose. Then, we zoom in a bit to the group level. This is how you are like some other humans. You might belong to the group of introverts, or Americans, or the group of go-getters, or even just messy people. Finally, we hit the individual level. This is how you are like no other human. These are your utterly unique, strange habits, your highly specific routines, or perhaps the fact that you absolutely love doing your taxes. Hey, no judgment here. But these specific similarities and differences are the absolute cornerstone of predicting behavior.
This naturally leads us into Section 4, the big questions.
Scientists and psychologists are constantly grappling with massive, unresolved philosophical debates regarding where personality actually comes from. Take freedom versus determinism. Do we really choose our behavior and have the power to change, or are we just determined from birth to be a specific type of person? Then there's heredity versus environment, the classic nature or nurture debate writing our behavioral code. Unique versus universal. Are we highly individualized or basically all the same deep down? And proactive versus reactive. Do we act on our own initiative or are we simply responding to stimuli around us? Actually, some of the most fascinating theories suggest an ongoing co-creation process, meaning our environments shape us and we in turn shape our environments. Nailing down the answers to these debates is absolutely critical for the field.
And here is exactly why it's so critical. Section 5. Predicting Behavior and AI. If psychologists can successfully map early traits to future behaviors, they can predict real-world outcomes. And sometimes, this is literally a matter of life and death. Take the dark, gripping example of the infamous killer Ted Bundy. Psychologists generally agree he had a classic sociopathic personality. Now, while theories debate whether this sociopathy stemmed from early romantic rejection, career failures, or deep family shame, the data shows his sociopathic behaviors started very, very early. In fact, some experts argue his extreme actions could have been statistically predicted. Look at these 3 classic warning traits that often form a sociopathic personality: pyromania, or being abnormally amused by fire, bedwetting as an older child, and torturing animals. Because these specific traits seem to statistically appear together over time, identifying them early gives psychologists a crucial window, a chance to potentially redraw a person's behavioral map, steering them toward positive traits and away from a devastating life of crime.
And today, we aren't just relying on human observation to find these patterns, we are bringing in artificial intelligence. AI is incredibly good at crunching massive amounts of survey and crime data to find everyday correlations between personality traits and real-world outcomes. For example, AI confirms that a trait like conscientiousness heavily correlates with getting good grades in school. Makes sense, right? But interestingly, extroversion heavily correlates with a higher rate of car accidents. Psychologists suspect this is literally due to an extrovert's constant need for external stimulation. If you have low agreeableness, you are statistically far more likely to exhibit highly competitive, entrepreneurial behaviors, and high neuroticism is closely linked as a predictor for the presence of mental illness. By letting AI process these massive data sets, we are getting an incredibly clear picture of how our internal traits dictate our external lives.
Finally, let's bring it all together in Section 6, the Big 5 traits. Before we get into what the Big 5 actually are, we need to address something pretty important. Unlike biology, which has the theory of evolution by natural selection to anchor it, personality psychology does not yet have a grand unifying theory. To understand why, think of that famous analogy of the blind man and the elephant. One man touches the trunk and says, "Oh, an elephant is like a snake." Another touches the side and says, "No, it's like a cow." Another grabs the ear and says, "It's like a stingray." They are all touching the exact same animal, but they're only experiencing one small part of the whole truth. That is exactly where we are with personality theories today. Trait theory, behavioral theory, humanistic, biological, and psychoanalytic theory. Every single one of these only touches one aspect of the giant, complex elephant that is human personality. But despite not having one unifying theory, top psychologists spent years whittling down thousands of descriptive words to find a practical happy medium, a framework that concisely describes the basics of anyone's personality. And they finally settled on 5. You can easily remember them using the acronym OCEAN, or CANOE. They are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Now, what's absolutely crucial to understand here is that you aren't just one thing or another. These traits exist on a sliding spectrum. Let's look at extroversion for a second. Its polar opposite is introversion. You aren't simply a 100% extrovert or a 100% introvert. You are a completely unique blend. You might be 25% extroverted and 75% introverted. We all lie somewhere along the scale between each of these big 5 traits and their absolute opposites. And that unique mix, that creates your highly customized behavioral fingerprint.
Which brings us to our final, somewhat provocative thought for today. If your personality is essentially a spectrum of traits, are you ready to push your boundaries? You might test as highly introverted today, sure, but as you focus on self-improvement, you can actually extend your range. You can literally learn to become a behavioral chameleon, adapting and pushing the boundaries of your own traits depending on the exact situation you're in. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Now that you know the underlying mechanics of your mind, will you just let your traits dictate your path, or will you actively co-create the personality you actually want to have? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.